Hi, everyone. Welcome to Community Eligibility Expansion, an important step toward healthy school meals for all, hosted by the Food Research and Action Center. I'm Steve Hayward, Communications Manager at Frey. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 60 minutes. We are recording the presentation and will send the recording and slides in a follow-up email. Closed captioning is available. To turn captions on, select Show Captions in the bottom taskbar and choose English as the spoken language. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. To ask a question, please use the Q&A tab in the bottom taskbar. With that, I'll pass it off to Erin Kennedy Heisem, Senior Child Nutrition Policy Analyst at Frey.
Thanks, Steve, and welcome everyone to our Thursday webinar with USDA. We're so excited to be here today to talk about community eligibility and the new final rule and what that may mean for you, your students, and your community. So let's get started. For those who may not be familiar with us, FRAC is the leading national nonprofit organization working to eradicate poverty-related hunger and undernutrition in the United States by advancing bold and equitable policy solutions. We do this by conducting research, advocating at the federal, state, and local levels, and providing technical assistance. Next slide, please. So we have a lot to jump into today. I'm going to start us off looking at where we've been with community eligibility and the data and participation levels over the last 9 years. Then I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed partner, Heather Hopwood, nutritionist at USDA FNS, so that she can go through the community eligibility background, the rulemaking process, what the final rule means, and resources available to program operators and partners. I'm going to come back and talk about some of the federal advocacy initiatives that FRAC is supporting, and then we will open up to audience Q&A. As my colleague Steve mentioned, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit questions at any point throughout this webinar. Next slide, please. So community eligibility participation has boomed over the last 9 years, particularly last year in the school year 2022-2023. And that makes perfect sense, right? We saw what was possible when all schools were able to offer all students meals at no charge under the pandemic-related waivers. It was a benefit to students and their families, and it eased the administration and operational burdens on school districts. Schools did not want to return to that tiered eligibility system when the federal public health emergency ended and those waivers were no longer available. Therefore, we saw tremendous growth last school year. Over 40,000 schools participated last school year in community eligibility. Next slide, please. Digging a little deeper into the data, that was more than 6,400 school districts participating last school year, nearly a 16% increase from the previous year. Those 40,000 schools represented an almost 21% increase in participating schools, reaching nearly 20 million students. Next slide, please. At FRAC, as you hopefully know, we believe that every student in every school in every state should have access to the nutrition they need to learn, thrive, and grow. That is why our big push is for a federal legislation allowing all schools in all states to offer all students healthy school meals at no charge. But we do see other pathways to ensuring students have access to these important meals. We support state legislation that provides subsidies to allow schools to offer all meals at no charge. And we also view the community eligibility provision as one step in expanding students' access to these nutritious meals. That's what we're going to focus on today. So I am proud and excited to turn it over to our colleague, Heather Hopwood at USDA. It's all yours, Heather.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you to FRAC for inviting us to participate in this webinar today. As Erin said, I'm Heather Hopwood. I work in USDA's child nutrition programs in school meals policy, and I'm excited to discuss this rule with you today. We really appreciate this opportunity to provide you with an overview of our final rule, child nutrition programs, community eligibility provision, increasing options for schools, which was published just a little over a month ago on September 26th. Next slide, please. So I'm going to provide some background and context on the community eligibility provision, and you'll hear me refer to it as CEP. After that, we'll discuss what we learned from the proposed rules comment period and then share the final rules provisions. I'll also talk about a few other CEP updates, and then, like Erin said, at the end, we'll take any questions that you might have. So let's start with a little bit of background info. Next slide, please. CEP is a way of operating the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs, and it allows high-need school districts, groups of schools, and individual schools to offer meals at no cost to all enrolled students for up to 4 years at a time. And eligibility for CEP is based on the percentage of identified students who are enrolled. Identified students are children who are directly certified or categorically eligible for free meals because they participate in another federal assistance program. So by taking advantage of income data that's collected by other assistance programs like SNAP, TANF, the food distribution program on Indian reservations, and in some states, Medicaid, it removes the burden for schools to check that income again. And then the identified student percentage is calculated by dividing the number of identified students by the number of enrolled students and multiplying by 100. So you'll probably hear me refer to that identified student percentage as the ISP throughout this presentation. So a school district, group of schools, or an individual school must meet a minimum ISP to be eligible to participate in CEP. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. So how are meals claimed? CEP eligibility is based on a school's or a group of schools' identified student percentage, and meal reimbursements are also determined using that ISP. Reimbursements are calculated using the ISP multiplied by a factor of 1.6. And the result of that calculation provides the percentage of meals that are reimbursed at the federal free rate. If that total is less than 100%, then the remaining percentage of meals are reimbursed at the federal paid rate. There are no reduced price meals claimed in CEP schools. And an ISP of 62.5 means that all meals would be reimbursed at the federal free rate. And this is because 62.5 multiplied by 1.6 equals 100. So that's 100% of meals reimbursed at the federal free rate. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked a little bit about how CEP works, let's talk about some of the benefits that it provides to students, parents, and schools. For students in CEP schools, they're able to receive a breakfast and a lunch every day at no cost. They don't have to worry about any stigma attached to receiving a free meal. And as a result of that, participation in school lunch and school breakfast has been shown to increase in CEP schools. Participation increases by about 7% for NSLP and about 12% for the school breakfast program. And that data is from our school nutrition and meal cost study. Oh, I'm sorry, it's from our CEP characteristics study that we published earlier this year. There are also benefits for parents. Parents don't have to fill out a household application for school meals or worry about keeping enough money in their children's school meal accounts. They simply send their children off to school knowing that they'll have an opportunity to eat a healthy breakfast and a healthy lunch. On the school side, there's a reduction in administrative burden from not having to disseminate and process applications and determine each child's eligibility. In addition, CEP simplifies and streamlines meal service operations. For example, CEP schools don't have to charge meals by type or at the free, reduced, and paid rates at the point of service. And this simplifies their counting and claiming. And just like parents benefit from not having to pay for school meals, schools benefit because CEP eliminates any unpaid meal charges, which we know is a very stressful and challenging issue for schools to manage. And finally, even for state agencies, CEP creates a streamlined review process during the administrative review because they don't have any applications that they're having to pore over on that review to make sure that the eligibility was determined correctly. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the rulemaking that has been underway since March of this year. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a quick recap of the journey we've been on. The CEP proposed rule was published earlier this year on March 23rd, and the primary change the rule proposed was to lower the minimum identified student percentage required to participate in CEP from 40% to 25%. And we proposed this change with the intent to expand access to CEP. We knew it would give more high-need schools the option to elect CEP and offer all students no-cost healthy school meals. And part of that, of course, is making sure that schools have the tools to determine if CEP is a financially viable option for them prior to implementing the provision. So after we published the proposed rule, we had a 45-day public comment period, which allowed us to receive feedback from our stakeholders, hopefully including many of you participating today. We did receive more than 10,000 comments on the CEP rule. We analyzed all those comments, which I'll talk a little bit more about next. And then we published the final rule on September 26th with an effective date of October 26th, 2023. So it actually just went into effect last week. Next slide, please. So we received a total of 10,625 comments. Of those, about 9,500 were relevant and non-duplicative, meaning the other 1,100 comments were either duplicate comments or had nothing to do with the CEP rule. About 850 comments were unique, and about 8,700 comments were received via 4 form letters. And the form letter campaigns each expressed support for lowering the minimum ISP to 25%. Next slide, please. So as part of our analyses, we looked to see which types of stakeholders commented on the rule. And as you can see here, we received comments from a wide variety of stakeholders, which is really helpful for us to ensure that we're considering all the different viewpoints and perspectives of organizations and individuals who might be impacted by the change. So it was great to see comments from state and local officials, excuse me, school districts and staff, advocacy organizations, and also hundreds of individuals. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a count of commenter submissions that expressed either support, opposition, or had a mixed response to the overall rule. And the majority of comments, 97%, demonstrated support for the proposed rule. And reasons for the support included benefits to children, both nutritionally and academically, as well as benefits to families, schools, communities, and program operators. Eliminating unpaid meal charges and student meal debt, and reducing LEAs and schools' administrative costs and burdens were specifically mentioned in comments supporting the rule. Fewer than 1% of comments demonstrated opposition to the proposed rule, and the opposition was noted for concerns about school finances and funding to support CEP. Some commenters stated that the proposed rule would financially burden schools and meal programs if all meals couldn't be fully reimbursed. And some commenters were also concerned that the proposed 25% threshold was chosen arbitrarily and could expand CEP to schools serving communities that don't need federal assistance. And then about 2% of comments offered mixed or conditional support to the proposed rule, citing a need to increase the CEP multiplier to make it more financially viable, and or they urged USDA to make school meals available at no cost to students nationwide. Next slide, please. So in analyzing the public comments, there were some significant themes that stood out. The most significant and prevalent theme among commenters for almost 9,000 comments was general support for the proposed rule provision for lowering the CEP ISP threshold because it would expand CEP, it would allow more children to access free school meals, reducing child hunger and decreasing food insecurity for America's families. More than 8,600 comments mentioned the general importance of feeding school children, noting that CEP removes barriers for participation in school meal programs, helps increase attendance, and improves academic outcomes. About the same number of comments mentioned that CEP helps reduce administrative costs and burden, streamlines operations specifically for LEAs in schools, and eliminates burden for families that would no longer be required to submit paper applications. Many of the comments highlighted that the proposed change to CEP would support the growing number of states that are choosing to invest funding to provide no-cost meals to all children. And some commenters pointed out that this rule would support rural, urban, tribal, and other minority communities. Particularly, commenters discussed how CEP has been useful in minimizing challenges such as food insecurity that are often faced by rural and underserved communities through access to free meals. And additionally, almost 1,000 commenters expressed concern that the proposed lower ISP may not be financially viable for some schools and school districts. Some noted that successful implementation in schools with lower ISPs would require additional funding, and many suggested that a solution would be to increase the CEP multiplier. So that's kind of a summary of the public comments we received. And now we can talk about what's specifically in the final rule. So after analyzing all the comments, we developed the final rule, again, which published on September 26th and became effective 30 days later, last week on October 26th. Next slide, please. So this chart summarizes the changes made by the final rule. As you can see here, we did not make any changes from the proposed rule to the final rule. The final rule lowers the minimum ISP from 40% to 25%. And that means a school district, a school, or a group of schools must have an ISP of at least 25% to elect CEP. And lowering that minimum ISP causes some conforming changes to a few other CEP requirements too. For example, eligibility for continuing CEP for an additional 5th year after the standard 4-year cycle or for a grace year is going to change. The eligibility to implement CEP for a grace year used to require the participating school or group of schools to have an ISP of less than 40%, but at least 30% in the 4th year of their CEP cycle. And as a result of the final rule, grace year eligibility will now require schools to have an ISP of less than 25%, but at least 15% in year 4 of their CEP cycle. Also, the definition of who is considered eligible and nearly eligible for CEP has changed due to the final rule. And this will impact CEP's identification, notification, and publication requirements as shown in the chart. Eligible LEAs in schools are those with ISPs of 25% or higher, and nearly eligible LEAs in schools are those with ISPs of at least 15% and up to 25%. So lowering the minimum ISP to 25% provides an opportunity for more LEAs with high proportions of low-income students to capitalize on CEP's administrative and professional benefits or operational benefits. Next slide, please. So we also want to be very clear about what this final rule does not include. The final rule does not raise the CEP multiplier. Increasing the multiplier requires congressional action, and USDA doesn't have the authority to raise the multiplier at this time. The National School Lunch Act allows the multiplier to range from 1.3 to 1.6, and USDA has already set the multiplier at the highest level allowed, which is 1.6. So we would need Congress to change the National School Lunch Act before we could increase it any further. Increasing the multiplier is included in President Biden's fiscal year 24 budget proposal. The budget requests that Congress increases the CEP multiplier from 1.6 to 2.5. And this would allow schools that participate in CEP to claim more meals at the federal free rate. Again, though, increasing the multiplier to 2.5 could only be established with congressional approval. It's also important to note that electing CEP is a local decision and not a federal mandate. As such, we plan to issue guidance and work with other federal and state agency partners to help school districts and schools make informed decisions about electing CEP. Lowering the threshold does result in more schools being eligible to elect CEP, but making CEP work with a lower ISP requires careful consideration and financial analysis to determine if meals can be offered at no charge to all students, while still maintaining the financial health of the nonprofit school food service account. I also want to mention that this final rule does not permit grouping beyond the LEA or school district level, meaning schools can't be grouped across different school districts or across the state. Similar to the multiplier, USDA doesn't have the authority to allow CEP groups beyond the LEA without Congress taking some type of action. Of course, an LEA can still have groups of schools within their own LEA, which has always been allowed. And then finally, the final rule doesn't change any deadline requirements. And I'll review those CEP deadlines in just a few minutes. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about financial viability. Next slide, please. So at USDA, we care very deeply about school nutrition departments. We want schools' CEP elections to be successful, and so making sound financial decisions is a very important factor of electing CEP. CEP schools need to consider the financial impacts of CEP prior to electing. We don't want any school district to elect CEP and then get themselves in financial trouble. So when deciding whether to elect CEP, schools have to consider their ability to provide meals at no cost, as well as covering operating costs. Schools may cover such expenses using federal assistance and other available funding, including state and/or local funds. If the federal assistance provided is less than the cost of providing all students free meals, then the difference has to be paid from non-federal sources. And this isn't meant to scare schools away from CEP, but just to serve as a reminder that it's super important to analyze all the funding available and the costs of providing meals to students at no charge under CEP prior to electing, especially for schools with lower ISPs. When assessing if CEP will financially benefit a school or district, potential increases in state reimbursements should be considered. That CEP characteristics study that we did found that LEAs that were participating in CEP were more likely than non-participating LEAs to report an increase in non-federal funds. And we found that that was primarily due to an increase in state funding. And then finally, we do have an estimator tool that can help LEAs determine the amount of federal funds that would be received under CEP. And we'll, on one of our resources slides at the end, we have a link to our CEP Resource Center, and that estimator tool is available there. We'll share that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. One of the main benefits of this final rule and lowering the minimum ISP is to make CEP available to more schools in states that have healthy school meals for all programs. So the map shown on this slide was created and is maintained by FRAC. The states in blue have adopted permanent healthy school meals for all programs, and states represented by other colors such as orange and green are working toward that goal. So we're very supportive of these programs since providing meals at no cost can increase student participation, eliminate stigma associated with participating in school meals, and improve household food security. So if you want to stay in the loop, Here's a link at the bottom of this slide for FRAC's landing page. It's a great resource for tracking and understanding these initiatives, and the site is updated frequently. Next slide, please. So as we've discussed, LEAs need to carefully consider whether CEP is financially viable, especially at lower ISPs like 25%. A school with an ISP of 25% claims 40% of their meals at the federal free rate. And this is because 25 times 1.6 equals 40. And then the remaining 60% of meals would be reimbursed at the federal paid rate, even though all meals served at the CEP school are served to students at no cost. Therefore, schools need to have outside funding to cover the cost. And outside funding is most commonly made available from the school district or a state. In states that are investing in healthy school meals for all, families of students at CEP schools that are now eligible for CEP will not have to complete applications to receive free school meals. In addition, CEP schools within such states will benefit through more efficient and streamlined school meal operations, while also, having that assurance that state funding is available to help them with their operational costs. Next slide, please. So again, the rule became effective last week on October 26th. As many of you know, the date to elect CEP for school year 23-24 has passed. It was June 30th, 2023. That deadline is established in statute and our regulations, so that's not something that states or school districts can change on their own. However, to allow schools to take advantage of the new minimum ISP during the current school year, the USDA is permitting state agencies to request waivers. So if you have questions about implementation of the final rule and using the new lower minimum ISP, please reach out to your state agency. The new minimum ISP will be available to all school districts for school year 24-25 without the need for a waiver. And the deadline for LEAs and schools to opt into CEP for next school year is June 30th of 2024. So all this information is explained in our memo, Community Eligibility Provision, implementing the new minimum identified student percentage. And we'll throw a link to that memo here in the chat for everyone as soon as I'm done speaking. Next slide, please. So in addition, that memo that I just mentioned explains how the rule impacts the notification and publication requirements for school year 23 or 24. Those requirements would be for the spring. State agencies and school districts must use the new minimum ISP of 25% to determine which LEAs and schools are eligible and nearly eligible for the identification, notification, and publication requirements. Those requirements will be due in April and May of 2024. This chart provides all the deadlines for electing CEP and notifying LEAs and schools of CEP eligibility in 2024. And we'll publish a memo in early 2024 to remind states and LEAs of these requirements. Next slide, please. So before we conclude, we want to share CEP resources that are available on our website. Next slide, please. We encourage you to visit our website through this link or QR code, where you can quickly connect to information about the final rule, including a one-page summary of the rule. From here, you can access our CEP Resource Center, which has links to other CEP rules, as well as that estimator tool that I mentioned. You can also find our policy guidance, webinar recordings, data, studies, and other tools that may help with your CEP implementation. We are in the process of updating our resources with the new minimum ISP, and we'll be publishing those resources as soon as they're available. So that's all the content we have. We hope this information was helpful, and I'll turn it back over to Erin, and then we'll be back to answer some of your questions in a few minutes.
Thanks, Heather. That was great. I know it's full of a ton of information. So we're going to talk about a little of the federal advocacy efforts that FRAC is supporting If you could advance, Steve. The first bill that we're supporting is the School Meals Expansion Act, which works to increase the CEP multiplier to 2.5. So as Heather mentioned, USDA does not have the authority to increase the multiplier beyond 1.6. That requires an act of Congress. This bill here would increase that multiplier to 2.5. Next. We are also supporting the No Hungry Kids in School Act, which allows for a statewide CEP option. So again, Heather mentioned that grouping must occur within an LEA, and we know that many districts and many states would benefit from grouping beyond the LEA level. So the No Hungry Kids in School Act does just that. It allows for a statewide CEP option. Next. And we are also supporting Expanding Access to School Meals Act, which increases the CEP multiplier to 2.5, expands the free meal eligibility to 200% of the federal poverty threshold, and makes eligibility retroactive to the beginning of the school year. So for many school districts on this webinar, you know that you will often get a call about the debt a student accrued prior to being determined eligible for free or reduced price meal. And I know, personally speaking, from having worked in a school district, it can be heartbreaking at times to tell a family that, yes, they still owe the money that was accrued before their eligibility was determined. So this bill would, in addition to increasing the multiplier and expanding eligibility, it would make eligibility retroactive to the beginning of the school year. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, FRAC's main purpose or main advocacy effort around this is ensuring that all students in all states have access to school meals to help them learn, thrive, and grow. That's why we are throwing our full support behind the Universal School Meals Program Act, which creates a nationwide Healthy School Meals for All program. If you scan the QR code here, it'll take you to one of our action sites where you can submit an email to your representatives, encouraging them to co-sponsor this bill. You can either copy and paste the link in the chat or use the QR code to take you there. And we encourage everyone to contact your representative and urge them to co-sponsor. Next, please. Okay, so we are going to open it up to Q&A now. I see a lot of questions coming in through the chat. As a reminder, if you could please use the Q&A function, which is a little easier for us to manage. At the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, you should see an icon that says Q&A. I'll turn it back over to Heather and USDA to start answering some of the questions.
Thanks, Erin. And I'm going to invite my colleague, Michelle Frey, who also works in school meals policy, to join me for the Q&A so we can try to get more of your questions answered.
Heather, I can start by answering a few that by sharing a few that I answered while you were doing your wonderful presentation.
Thank
you. Sure. So one question came in related to summer EBT. We've actually gotten a few questions related to summer EBT. This question was, does participating in CEP extend to all families being eligible for summer EBT, or do separate eligibility determinations apply? And the answer is that children who are in CEP schools who are not part of the identified students, they will have to complete an application to get summer EBT benefits. So just being enrolled in a CEP school will not confer benefits for summer EBT. And as many of you may know, that interim final rule is expected to be published at the end of this calendar year, and more details about applications and everything associated with summer EBT will be included in that rule. And there was a question about can districts regroup to change their claiming percentage or to add schools above 40% if their state applied for a waiver. So in general, if a state was approved for a waiver for mid-year CEP elections, then yes, that would provide an opportunity for LEAs within the state to regroup and to pull in any eligible school, even those that were previously eligible. But that's just a general answer. So for any specifics, I would refer you to your state agency, and they will talk you through exactly how it could work in your state.
So I can take a question in the chat. Must school districts make their ISP data publicly available? And then they commented that certain programs may want to see the ISP to determine eligibility for other programs. The publication and notification requirements do require states to submit or post lists of eligible and nearly eligible LEAs and schools on their public websites. And then they send the link to USDA annually. And we also link to those lists from our USDA website. I can say that we've been working pretty closely with the Department of Education, National Center for Education Statistics, about measuring poverty in schools, and they're very interested in the ISP being a poverty measure. So that is something that we're talking about with them, and we've talked to a few states to see if that's feasible or what types of schools would be excluded from those measures. So that is something that we're exploring, using the ISP as more of a broader poverty measure. But we're not quite there yet in terms of like having it be an effective measure and available across the board for all schools. And of course, some programs require individual student data. So we are trying to figure those things out. But I think I could probably also be kind of in the same response answer the question about Title I funding. Because a question in the chat says, how does this affect funding for Title I and other programs where funding is contingent on free and reduced percentage? So for Title I, we have a policy memo that we worked with the Department of Education on that walks through different ways that you can meet Title I requirements without free and reduced price applications. So for example, using the direct certification data is an option. Using the direct certification times 1.6 is an option. There are also other options, and I'll put the link to that guidance in the chat for you all. But meeting Title I requirements is not a barrier to CEP participation. If there are other programs that rely on your free and reduced price data, we always encourage school districts who are interested in CEP to gather all the stakeholders around the table, let them know what you're thinking about, let them know that this free and reduced price application data may go away, so that you all can talk about other ways that those benefits can be given to students without the application data.
And Heather, I can take a few. And I think, and Erin just posted in the chat the link to our CEP Resource Center, which has the guidance that Heather just mentioned. And as well on that website, there's a few other links for how this could work for AP exams, SATs, because there was another question about just, again, not having that individual student eligibility. How does that confer benefits for other free things? So for those that we have, they're listed on our website, and hopefully you find that to be helpful. But there were a couple questions related to the multiplier. So one question is there any research supporting a 2.5 multiplier that was similar to the research that resulted in the 1.6? I'm not aware of any research in that area. I don't know, Erin, if you have seen research supporting a higher multiplier.
I don't have it off the top of my head, although I do know that even when the proposed and final rule came out, there shows some variations in that multiplier, really capturing the intended population at various economic levels within a school system. So that 1.6 may not be sufficient for schools at lower ISP levels itself. It might not fully capture the children who would qualify for a free or reduced price meal through an application. So we know that 1.6 is not perfect and not a perfect estimate, especially years later after it was first determined.
Yeah, and so, right, so like Erin mentioned, maybe there's some data out there, but as Heather mentioned before, by statute, we don't have the authority to raise it beyond 1.6. And there was another comment about raising the free claiming percentage. And again, the only way to do that would be to increase the multiplier, which we don't have the authority to do. We're already at the maximum.
And Michelle, I'll jump in again because similarly, there's a question about the legislation that I mentioned. And so I will link in the chat to one of our blogs that identifies the legislation that we are supporting. Again, I'll send in the link for the Universal School Meals Program Act that can help you contact your representatives to send them an email very easily. And then in the follow-up email, I can attach some resources. So in addition to getting this webinar and the recording, my colleague Steve will also send some Healthy School Meals for All and community eligibility resources that we've identified at FRAC and created at FRAC that might help you as you go to advocate for legislation that allows for a higher multiplier.
And just to be very clear, because there was another question saying, like, when can we expect a decision on an increase to the multiplier? That there's nothing pending for a higher multiplier. For your planning purposes for this year and in the future, 1.6 is what we have in our law and is what is in our regulations, and there is nothing currently available that would change that. So just to be very clear, like when you're trying to assess if CEP is financially viable, you use the 1.6, that's the multiplier. I feel like we've addressed most of them, or all of them even.
I know that you touched on this, Michelle, but there is a question about, determining eligibility for students for other programs. And so I was just on a panel with a state SNA, and the directors were talking, sharing information amongst each other. And one director brought up, it's difficult for me to say this student qualifies for free meals because he's in a CEP school. And what another district offered up was, the way we phrase it is we provide a letter for that student or family that says this student has access to free school meals through participation in the community eligibility provision. So sometimes working with wording and collaborating with your fellow districts on how they are wording those letters, indicating that yes, the student themselves is access to free school meals through the school's participation in community eligibility can help. And if you want follow-up information or resources on that, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and I will connect you with some of those districts.
Thank you, Erin. I see another question that we can answer. Without an increase in the multiplier, what increase of schools participating do you expect? It's a great question. Again, we really expect most of the uptake at these lower ISPs to be in the states that do have Healthy School Meals for All initiatives, because the state is providing funding to cover any gap that is between the operational costs and providing free meals to all students. So that's where we expect the uptake to be based. For every rule we have to do a little analysis, and so the analysis we did for this rule, we said we expected that this would expand CEP to almost 3,000 school districts in those states. Beyond, that's just our best guess. So beyond that, there could be additional uptake. Some of those school districts in those states might not take it up, but that's just our best guess based on the data that we have.
We have a few questions about mid-year waivers. So I think in general, we probably have, I don't know, maybe 15 to 20 states that were interested in doing mid-year waivers. We don't have that data publicly available at this point. So if you're, I would just encourage you to reach out to your state agency to see if they are one of the states that did request and were approved for a mid-year CEP waiver. And there was a question about if we know how this change would impact eligibility for programs like CalFresh Healthy Living. And I don't think those of us that are on this panel do know how it impacts it. But I just encourage you to reach out to the California State Agency, and I'm sure they would be able to help.
Michelle, I'm sorry that if you already answered this, but is there a deadline for requesting the waiver, for state agencies to request the waiver?
There isn't a deadline, though. We haven't approved, we're not approving elections past the end of March. So there's not, states can request it. I guess that would be the deadline. So states could request it anytime up until LEAs would be able to elect by the end of March, whatever deadline would help them meet that. But
I see a question about, is USDA suggesting getting rid of NSLP for schools adopting CEP? And would that mean they rely solely on direct certification? We're definitely not suggesting getting rid of NSLP. CEP is just a way of operating the National School Lunch and School Breakfast program. So those programs are still operating in CEP schools. CEP is just a way of operating and offering free meals to all students and claiming based on the ISP. So we definitely don't want to get rid of NSLP by any means.
I think they corrected it to say NSLP applications later.
Oh, I see that now. Well, I mean, it is a way of, CEP is a way of removing some paperwork and relying on data that already exists. So it does represent a government efficiency by like us sharing data with SNAP or with TANF or with Medicaid. So to the extent that we can get rid of paperwork for folks, that's great, but not all schools are eligible for CEP. So we can't just get rid of it for all schools at the point that we're at right now. So we still do rely on those applications for non-CEP schools.
There's a question that I don't quite understand in here. It's about having a written response to how to obtain eligibility data to households for waivers. And I think maybe there's some misunderstanding. So the waivers come from the state agencies. Households aren't involved in any waivers. So I would just encourage you, whoever asked that question, to maybe just follow up with your state agency to make sure you're clear on what's going on this year. So just to recap, the waivers are just for mid-year implementation to allow newly eligible schools to take advantage of CEP this year. If you're in a state that wasn't able to implement a waiver this year, then that 25% minimum ISP is available to all LEAs starting in July of 2024, so next school year. So it'll be open to everybody. We're just allowing it this year for states and LEAs who are able to make it work.
Okay, I think that's most of the questions that we have through. Are there any final questions coming in? We'll give you a second to type them out as fast as you can. Or you can always follow up with me. I did put my email address in the chat. It's ehyssom, EHYSOM @frac.org. You can always reach out to me and I will be sure to pass it on to Heather and Michelle if I don't know the answer myself. I often don't, but we are good at finding the answers for you. Steve, if that's all the questions we have, we can go to our final slide. If you're not already connected with us here at FRAC, we would love to hear from you and learn more about what you're doing and how we can help you. You can sign up for our newsletters and e-letters through our website. And as always, feel free to reach out to me with any questions you might have. We appreciate your participation on this webinar, your interest in the community eligibility provision, and all the work you do to serve our students across the nation. A huge thank you to Heather and Michelle for joining us. It is always a pleasure to work with USDA in partnership as we work to make sure that all children have access to the healthy food that they need. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin.